Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. President Emmanuel Macron is in China for a 3-day state visit at a moment of deep strain in Europe-China relations. His goal? Push Beijing to exert real pressure on Moscow over Ukraine while defending Europe against what Brussels views as increasingly unfair Chinese economic practices, trade security, espionage concerns, and the broader balance of power all hang over the talks. To unpack the stakes and the limits of Europe's leverage, we're joined by François Godement. He's a special advisor at Institut Montaigne. Mr. Godement, welcome back to TP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. So what is President Macron's agenda, and how realistic is it that he will succeed in achieving his goals?
I think his agenda is based first on postulating that it's never useless to talk. It's always useful. And that he should use the visit to imprint on Mr. Xi Jinping and possibly on some of his team that we have come at a crossroad in EU-China relations. The export flow from China has been increasing. In 2025, it's actually a tsunami. And it is, in fact, not strongest on France. France is not the strongest manufacturing basis in Europe. Italy and Germany, which have a larger manufacturing share, are hit harder, even harder than France is. But the goal will be to show to President Xi Jinping that this trend will literally force the EU to take harsher measures against Chinese exports. That's the first item. I'm sorry I placed it before the Ukraine agenda. I'm absolutely sure that the Ukraine and Russia issues will also play a role, but I somehow feel there that President Macron, as others have done before him, can only repeat a mantra, and that China, unfortunately, has by now chosen its camp even more visibly than previously.
Well, China seems to be walking a bit of a tightrope, doesn't it, between supporting Russia surreptitiously and strengthening its relationships, certainly its trade relationships, in the European Union. Now, let's start, as you mentioned, the European-China trade relationships. You talk about more robust action by the EU. What could that include?
Well, we're seeing it on display with the small packages, small parcels issue, where the EU hadn't completely been at fault. It was just too slow, as often. It has to take in 27 members. It has to take in the difficulties of implementation, which, by the way, belong to member states, not to the EU itself. It has sped up the calendar. It's pushing member states to adopt measures more quickly to stem the flow of these small packages that were unregulated, mostly unwatched, mostly tax-free. And the next step could be raising import duties on a number of items. There are several sectors which are under investigation besides the auto industry, which is, of course, the best known. I think President Macron is going to try and explain to China that even if there are natural advantages for one country or another in trade, if one country has a winner-takes-all mentality and leaves nothing to offer to the other, there is no more international trade. And therefore, that it is almost China that is bringing upon itself the protectionist, what it calls the threat of protectionism throughout Europe. He's going to explain, I think, to China that Europe doesn't have much choice to make because of this tsunami of exports.
Right. I mean, the EU currently has a deficit, a trade deficit with China of about $357 billion, which is quite a lot. You talk about import duties and so on, but what about the other way around? What are the opportunities for exporting more to China? Will that be part of the discussion?
It should be, just as investment in China is important and investment by China is important. Undoubtedly, President Macron will not, go against these traditional actions. But let's look at some facts. In the past 5 years, the value of European exports of Chinese exports to Europe, to the EU, has risen by 27%. In volume, these exports have risen by 41% because the price of Chinese goods is constantly being deflated. In the other direction, the export from the EU to China has risen by 1%, only 1%. And that sums up the difficulty. Of course, this leads to temptations by European firms to relocate in China if the production basis is more efficient, if they're able to circumvent informal barriers for access to the China market. But it is deeply biased, and the gap is not decreasing, it's increasing. So, of course, you will still find companies that want to increase their business in China. It's, after all, the second market in the world now, and still growing, even though the Chinese economy is not going very well. It's still growing at a small pace, but it's not completely stagnant, and that's important.
Right, okay, so there is, I do want to move on to Ukraine in just a second, but there is one other thing I want to touch on. COVID made very clear how vulnerable the rest of the world is to Chinese supply chains. And so this is leverage that China could use at any time. Should European and other countries be taking that into their calculations when entering into trade agreements with China, that there is this risk associated with that country?
Of course they should. And the recent display by China of what it called counter-sanctions against US sanctions, but that in fact hit the entire world and hit Europe first, on rare earths and permanent magnets, the stuff that's used in electric vehicles, that brought the point home to many Europeans. There are areas where we must decouple or at least ensure a diversity of supply. It's very dangerous to be tied to China as a monopoly supplier, so to speak. And that's where the issue of China's overall trade policy is really a problem, because if we look at the latest 5-year plans that's been publicized in China, it shows ambition in just every industrial sector, every export sector. It's not renouncing low-end goods or low-tech, it's just pushing further in new high-tech sectors. And President Xi Jinping has as a motto to increase the dependence of other partners on China and to decrease the dependence of China on its partners. That's what we're up against. I would add, of course, that the US is also a problem, and that the fact that there is not clear unity of action or coordination between the US and us in these days is an added problem, because it sort of helps China to manage Europe as a kind of second-grade partner, which doesn't have the hard power or the courage or leverage act.
Monsieur Godement, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I do want to touch on Ukraine. Do you think President Macron is going to take this opportunity to exert some kind of influence on Xi Jinping to get involved in the Ukraine war?
I think he's going to lecture him, which he won't be the first European statesman to try and do so. I don't think China's support for Russia is surreptitious anymore. When you see a private Chinese company take part of the stock for the main Russian manufacturer of drones, the same drones that in fact bomb over Ukraine every day, you can say that China has chosen its side and has also told the EU very clearly so when Mr. Wang Yi, who is responsible for Chinese foreign policy, told Mrs. Callas, who heads the EU's foreign policy arm, that China could not afford to see Russia losing. So it's going to be a very hard proposition, and probably President Macron will try and ask the Chinese to at least play some relay road and messages, at least perhaps to limit the extent of its engagement backing Russia. But I don't think that he will succeed these days. The issue is very much, I wouldn't even say in the hands of Mr. Trump, but rather in the hands of Mr. Putin.
Right. So what is it? I mean, what's in it for China to be supporting Russia in this way?
It's very important because first it deflects possible US pressure on itself. Second, because the successful example of European sanctions and American sanctions, of course, against Russia has really surprised the Chinese. The fact that we could seize the foreign currency reserves of Russia, perhaps not use them. As you know, there is a big debate in the EU on whether we can actually use them to support Ukraine. But seizing them is a very, very black precedent for China, which has a lot of foreign currency reserves stashed abroad and would fear such a move. So it's important in that respect that to keep Russia standing up. There are other benefits, of course. Free flow of oil and gas, mineral resources, a market. It's a minor market if you compare it to other markets. But still, so this is kind of a reliable ally, which is certainly not an equal to China, but which China doesn't see why it should dispense with it. And as much as it gets bad words from Europe and even the United States lack the kind of action that would genuinely deter China.
Right. Well, China is building up its leverage even as we speak. Mr. Godement, thank you very much, as always, for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good evening, sir.
Thank you, sir, and hello to your audience.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Bye.